All right, welcome. My name is Maria Hlavajová. I'm General and Artistic Director of BAK, Basis voor Actuele Kunst, in Utrecht, in the Netherlands, which is a forum for theoretically informed and politically driven culture practices at the meeting point of art, knowledge production, and social action. It's been great pleasure and privilege, actually, to be able to be part of the FEINART network for me and my colleagues at BAK. Within the FEINART network, BAK has served as one of the partner organizations. And it's truly wonderful to see all the ESRs and other people from the network and everybody who joined us today here at the FEINART Summer School, here at the Zeppelin University. And I'm particularly thrilled that we can continue many conversations we've been engaged in, our continuous, ongoing, passionate conversations, as well as beginning new ones, so as to think together through many questions and many concerns and even more urgencies we share at this point. In this respect, I think it's important, and I do it for myself now and then, to remind myself and ourselves in this case of one of the key urgencies of this learning program, nested within it and somewhat hidden in this wonderful abbreviation FEINART. So I keep reminding myself that it stands for the future of European independent art spaces in a period of socially engaged art. To be sure, in the current conjuncture, every word of this matters, and every word of this needs to be rethought, needs to be inquired into, in the context, again, of the ecological, social, political, and cultural circumstances at present. The notion of the future, but then as the future otherwise, to continue with the language from this morning, future otherwise, if you will, circumnavigating the normative modern chronopolitics of linearity that has been unfolding as a concatenation of disasters. And seek instead the politics of time that allows for care and for making time, again, to connect to the lecture, wonderful lecture and conversation this morning. The future of European independent art spaces. So, of course, the future, as I just mentioned, the notion of Europe, needs rethinking, reimagining, and reworking, not the least because of its colonial pasts and presents, but today especially in relation to the ongoing tragic war on the continent. We need to inquire into the notion of independence, the many registers of which somehow belong to the repertoire of capitalist modernity. And as we want to engage collectivity, collaboration, and indeed the social, we might need to think and practice interdependence and maybe even ultra-dependence instead. And indeed, given the contemporary conjuncture of multiple entwined planetary crises, the future of art spaces is definitely at stake. Now, co-conspiring vectors of climate breakdown, as well as continued colonial exploitation, the rise of radical right-wing movements and fascisms and other authoritarianisms, the return of or to the imperialist paradigm, wars with the outlook of nuclear annihilation that intensifies every second, the weaponization of food and energy and of just about everything, growing poverty worldwide, biological and informational pandemics, the development of new and potentially destructive and uncontrollable technology, and with it the radically changing fabrics of our publics. All of the above and more suggests, at least to me, that engaging a conversation about art institutions today should be not merely about the institutional infrastructures, says spaces of display, systems of classification and categorization, archives and professional trainings and career pathways for these, excellence criteria, juries and prizes and competitions and what have you, but rather about the collective practices of world-making that the institution must help facilitating, and with it, collective experimenting with the ways of how to be together otherwise. Now, what are the possibilities for understanding and practicing the institutions today differently, as situated, embodied, and relational propositions of another politics, as sites of political possibility, not merely against the condition of the contemporary, but in spite of it? Building on the legacies of institution critique, but moving away from its spectacle. How can we concurrently resist and enact the institution through critical imagination as practice, so as to articulate and embody the possibilities of livable life in common? How can institutions become those critical public forums in which a future practice of living together otherwise can be not merely imagined, but rehearsed and lived in the now? It is in this context that I have an extraordinary pleasure to welcome and introduce our next keynote speaker, Carolina Rito, a researcher and curator whose work explores the epistemic capacities of the curatorial, expanding practice-based research in the fields of curating visual arts, visual cultures, and culture studies. Carolina is professor of creative practice research at the Research Center for Arts, Memory and Communities at Coventry University in the United Kingdom, where she leads the center's critical practices research strand. Now, I've been following Carolina's curatorial projects eagerly and closely, including some of her recent projects such as critical practices talks, live futures, critical pedagogies, and notably institution as praxis, within which we had a number of enjoyable and really, truly thought-provoking conversations together, and which also laid the groundwork for this wonderful publication that Carolina co-edited, Institution as Praxis, New Curatorial Directions for Collaborative Research. And this publication has been truly important and inspiring for my work, especially because it looks at new research methods at the intersection between visual cultures, curating the arts, and critical theory, and it addresses the emergence of the curatorial as a field of practice beyond exhibition making. And those of you who know my practice understand how truly close and important this is to me. The curatorial as a field of practice beyond exhibition making. It is also closely it's closely connected to the notion of the so-called practice research. And I think as researchers and practitioners within the field, what we still refer to as social engaged practices. You already hear that I'm into reworking our vocabularies in order to move about the situation that feels like stagnant, interregnum, engaged, delving in multiple crises. This notion of practice research, traversing multiple fields, not the least the field of art and humanities, by going really beyond, as of course, needless to explain, is the research conducted by means of practice. I think this is really a crucial compendium to look at. The book also crucially acknowledges that research-driven programming in curatorial artistic practices today has advanced radical ways of perhaps navigating through the world, but importantly creating or producing knowledge which goes far beyond the repetition of what's already known. It very much reflects on what I very often through my practice talk about or refer to as anticipatory learning, which is coming together with others, living, non-living, organic, non-organic, human, non-human, in order to learn what does not yet exist, which involves imagining the world we want, knowing how problematic the offhand use of the notion of we is in this, but coming together to imagine the world we want and living it together as if that were possible. If I recall our exchanges correctly, a memory plays tricks on me. after the pandemic, in the middle, after is a bit of a courageous statement, in the middle of pandemic kind of situation. This research strand, institution as praxis, I think back in 2018, 2019, maybe even earlier. Carolina, you were at Nottingham Contemporary, where you were head of public programs and research at the time, and were also involved with the Midlands Higher Education Culture Forum. And that was the occasion within which I also had the privilege to speak. It was at the time when you initiated the UK-based collaborative research working group. All of these activities actually leading to the advocacy document on collaborative research. Really important policy document, if you will, which today is a crucial resource and compendium of recommendations for funding bodies and research councils with focus on the relevance of practice research in the advancement of new research methodologies and epistemes and possibilities for artistic practice to, let's use big words, change the world. Crucial work, Carolina. Now, building on the wealth of these knowledges and practices, today Carolina Rito will think through the notion of the infrastructures of the exhibitionary, reimagining the epistemic and aesthetic functions of art spaces. Carolina will address these infrastructures of the exhibitionary as a way of exploring the critical tools for the future of institutions of display under an expanded notion of contemporary art and curating, all the while asking the question, how can the culture sector mobilize its exhibitionary skills and tools to devise a decolonial and de-liberal response to reimagine its futures? Please join me in welcoming Carolina Rito. Thank you very much. You all set? Do you need something now?
No, I think I'm set. I think so. So this one works. Yeah, I don't need to hold the mic.
Just lungs. You need to use lungs.
Lungs. Okay, I think I can do that. Yeah. A little bit speechless. It's a great honor to be introduced by Maria Lavajova. Her work and the work of Bach have been of great inspiration for my own practice and my own thinking. So quite remarkable moment for me individually. I wanted also to thank Karen for the very generous invitation. It's been great so far to be exposed to the ongoing conversations that you set together over the last, I think, 2-3 years or so, and are still undergoing. Are we good here? Yeah. I wanted to say that it's not exciting for me to be able to, in a way, respond to what the proposition of the project is, but also to be able to reconnect with colleagues that I haven't seen for such a long time. So it's, for me, really a pleasure to be here today. So I don't want to play tricks on you, but really the title of the talk doesn't necessarily speak directly to the content. The reason being that in conversation as well with Maria, I decided to step back a little bit and instead of go full on with what I mean by infrastructures of the exhibitionary, I'm going to rephrase it just for the sake of your attention, and this is before lunch, so I'm sure we are all thinking of something else at the same time. So in order to focus on the main ideas I want to share with you, I'm going to leave behind for the time being the infrastructures of the exhibitionary. We might have time to go back to that during the Q&A. Let's see how things work. So I wanted also just quickly to mention Elke's talk, and thank you so much for setting up this meeting today in such a great tone and fantastic conversation. I hope it will speak to, or I have some of the things to contribute and to complement some of the issues you put on the table. So I just need to move my things here. Okay. So reading the invitation from Karen, what I'm going to be doing is to try and bring together three main elements that you will also see in the title of this meeting. So the idea of the social, let me just put this in, sorry. Just to get access to the keyboard. So what I want to do is to bring together, in a kind of a triangulation, the idea of the social, also the idea of ecologies that you see expressed in the title, but here I want to add ecologies of practices, okay? It will speak also to the larger framework, but for the time being, I want to stick to the ecologies of practice. And finally, crisis in the plural. And you'll see that the word crisis will be actually a shorthand for the infrastructure of the exhibitionary. So this is how things are going to speak to each other. I also tend to think of these crises as kind of challenges affecting the Western institutions of display. So you'll see me using kind of these terms interchangeably. So what I want to do today is to look at three main aspects in relation to this triangulation. I want to revisit the conditions for cultural production today, so to think of just to bring us back to the purpose, so to speak, not an ontological purpose, but a genealogy purpose. The second point that I wanted to shed light on is, as I said, the challenges or crises affecting the Western institutions of display. And just for me to explain to you what I mean is by institutions of display, I'm not necessarily interested here, for the sake of the argument, on the nature of the institution, say if it's a museum or a gallery or a commercial gallery or an artist-run space or whatever that is. I'm more interested in the gesture of making public. What is that thing of moving something to the front and make it public? What is that event that is generated? And what are the logics and also the regimes that inform that gesture? So that's why I will use the institutions of display. It's quite generic, but I think I need that to be able to articulate what I want to tell you today. And then the final point is to review the design of the social under the neoliberal conditions and the imperatives of growth and entertainment. And these will finally speak more clearly to the whole discussion around social engaged practices. So you have to bear with me, okay? So basically what I'm trying to say is that I will be looking at cultural policies and how they are informing the design of the social today, which will include necessarily social engaged practices, but not exclusively, okay? So in order to start, I'm a little bit confused about these slides, so I'm gonna hold on to. So in order to start, I wanted to share with you an anecdote. I was recently in the Netherlands, also part of one of these Maria Sklodowska-Curie program on a secondment at the Van Abbe Museum. And while I was there, I had the chance not only obviously to engage with colleagues at the Van Abbe Museum, but also to talk to other practitioners in the country. And as part of that, I had the chance to talk to Charles Lundbrush. I know I'm mispronouncing, and I apologize for that. Charles is the head of research and curatorial practices at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And while we are talking, and he's reflecting on the program that he's currently designing with his team, especially, I think he joined the team roughly a year ago. I'm looking at colleagues from Netherlands. So a year ago, so it's kind of pretty much fresh. And he's telling me about the kind of challenges or the kind of endeavor. And he says something along these lines, and bear with me because this is not a direct quotation, it's me kind of thinking through the conversation and trying to bring it to you here. So he says something along these lines. If we take the old purpose of what these institutions were designed to do, and for those of you that are not familiar with the Stedelijk Museum, is a modern and contemporary art museum. So it's a collecting institution and holds on to the principles of conserving and interpreting the collection along the lines of art history. Let's leave it like this. So going back to Charles' point, so if we take the old purpose of what these institutions were designed to do, meaning to collect, conserve, and interpret modern and contemporary art, in 100 years, people will come to the museum to contemplate the epitome of modernism that reflects the Western paradigms of art history based on the neutrality and grandiosity of the white European man, which is represented by the cis heteronormative white male institution. Or, he says, we do something now. And we start by asking, what is the purpose of these infrastructures? What are we here for? And we establish a new ambition. We work towards that new ambition, and then a new kind of statement, imaginary, eventually institution, can start emerging. So I wanted us to sit with this question. Not this. What is, sorry, let me just clarify what's going on here. Yeah, I forgot to copy this one, so bear with me. Okay, so what is the function of institutions of display? Sorry, I have two screens here and it's confusing me, but I understand. I have the preview of the previous slide. So, so let's sit with the question, what is the function of institutions of display? And of course, this is, one could say, a kind of a normal question and always relevant to be asked if we are not in the business of repeating old regimes of truth and thinking about our role and function when we lead or work with cultural institutions. But not least, I would say, in the context where museums in the European context have been challenged and asked to rethink their foundations, and not least the objects they hold on to, eventually most of them looted or illegally brought to the continent. And so this reflection, which is also what Charles is taking up, it's not an easy and simple question. So if we hold on to that, let me read a little bit now. What is this all for? We keep asking ourselves what to do with our infrastructures and institutions, how to make them more equitable, purposeful, how to get more people through the door. I'm sure you all have heard this one. We also despair with funding applications and don't know how to connect the work we really need to do with what the funders are interested in, requesting and demanding from us. Always the new big thing, the trendy, the cutting edge, the not yet seen, the spectacular. We run around from opening to opening, from biennial to biennial. Curators contact artists for studio visits and burn the artist's productive time asking them the same questions and making them repeat the same stories. And we are all tired, overworked, and we keep asking ourselves, why are we not doing more and better? I would like to pause here and probably take the opportunity to shed light on something else that is at play when we have these kind of drivers. Maybe the work that needs doing is not as fashionable and sexy and cutting edge as some seem to believe. It might be actually sometimes pretty boring, and it might not look so contemporary. For those of you that remember Tina Segal's performance, 2005, Venice, representing the German pavilion. It's an empty gallery, the German pavilion, and you have the gallery assistants dancing and coming to the viewers, to us audience, and singing, "This is so contemporary." Maybe it's really not so contemporary. So When we think about the role of cultural institutions, we might need to rephrase the question and instead ask ourselves, how is neoliberalism shaping the paradigm of culture now, today, in our times? How are our practices being informed by neoliberal logics that most of the time sit outside, I would argue, of the institutions and the practices themselves? Moreover, and I think for the sake of this conversation, conference, etc., how are neoliberal cultural policies directly shaping the notion of the social today? Basically, the culture question needs to be at the heart of our inquiry as we delve into the ways contemporary practices have been shaped. And I'm going to do something which is to remix Frederick Engel's 1872 on the housing question. It's a quite well-known quote. I actually didn't copy it to my slides, unfortunately. I'm sorry, so I will read it slowly. This is not a direct quotation. I'm going to change it to speak to, instead of the housing question, to speak to the cultural institution question. And it goes by this. It is not that the solution of the cultural institution question simultaneously solves the culture question, but that only by the solution of the culture question, that is, by the abolition of neoliberal imperatives and colonial paradigms, is the solution of the cultural question made possible. In short, I see you are a little bit, what's going on? In short, or in other words, there is no point in trying to sort out the issue of the cultural institutions without looking into what is currently informing notions of culture under a post-colonial, and I mean post-colonial and neoliberal paradigm. So in order to help us unpack, sorry, I'm not looking at this corner over here. In order to help us unpack and populate what I mean by this paradigm, what I'm going to be doing is to look at the so-called crisis affecting the institutions of display that I mentioned before. And this will be done in three sections. The first one is the coloniality of the exhibitionary. I'm going to run through the three elements and then I'm going to go back to the first one, okay? So the coloniality of the exhibitionary. Then I will be looking at the neoliberal business model in the cultural sector. And finally, the social prescribing and social service provision in the arts. Although they are separate blocks, they very much speak to one another, okay? So we need to think of them as this, not one and the same, but as constitutive elements of the paradigm that we are trying to unpack here. So let's go back to the first one. I'm going to read. There is no neutral act of exhibition and no neutral exhibition space. Any consideration of the genealogy of museums and exhibitions, and for these matter, as I mentioned before, institutions of display. So I'm not leaving aside or outside of this frame anything that we do under the umbrella of the curatorial. So, just going back to the beginning of the sentence, any consideration of the genealogy of museums and exhibitions, and also institutions of display, cannot overlook the first European museums and the international world fairs. These two formats are known for playing an important role in the consolidation of the colonial episteme, of racial superiority and ontological differences, which refuse to recognize the intellectual and cultural complexity of non-European peoples. These exhibitionary practices also supported the formation, dissemination, and consolidation of disciplines, discourses, and colonial paradigms that differentiate peoples, geographies, knowledges, and experiences. So scholars in the field, and there's many, I'm going to name just a few, Wayne Modis, Rolando Vasquez, Douglas Cream, Tony Bennett, have provided compelling analysis about how the apparatus of display informed the production, reception, and interpretation of art, disciplinary knowledge, historical narratives, and epistemic paradigms. So we have to situate museums, and we know many in European context, that in a way function as an important mechanisms to establish what we call the colonial episteme. And this is part of the genealogy of exhibition making per se. Moreover, these authors go on to contextualize how recoded and rebranded imperial rhetoric continues to legitimize the ownership of looted objects and memories today. And as I said before, there's many examples. Actually, there's a book that came out like 2 years ago, I think, by Dan Hicks, that is titled The British Museum, that looks at the British Museum and how the project itself is incredibly problematic, just to leave it like that. But we have other examples. We have the Tropen Museum in the Netherlands, the African Museum in Belgium. We have also the Quai Branly in Paris, the Ethnographic Museum in Lisbon, etc., etc. And they are still open, and they are there's very little changes, very few changes in what they do and how they show what they do. So most of the analysis draw notably upon Michel Foucault's elaboration of the modern institutional technologies for the control and discipline of forms and of social and political life. This is basically the work that we can read in Discipline and Punish. I think the funny thing is that Foucault left and theorized the museum specifically, and this is because Foucault is looking at the carceral archipelago, and part of the argument is that certain institutions are created but left outside of the sight of the new citizens, of the new men, as he calls, with a capital M, as Elke has referred very clearly. Important because it's a category, it's not an ontology. And so interesting how Foucault left the museum and theorized, as I was saying. And so what these theories, specifically I'm thinking of The Birth of the Museum by Tony Bennett, what they try to do is to bring the museum in order to speak to the same apparatus, but instead of being left outside of the sight of the onlookers, is actually where the technologies of vision operate in the centrality of the urban space, and also spaces that are meant to be free, so that the more people are exposed to the exhibitions, the better, because it's part of a indoctrination process. So I'm going to quote Tony Bennett just briefly, because it's a passage that gives us kind of a summary of what I just said, and this is, as you see, 95, so it's a quite sort of, we could say, old publication, but very much an important, I think, still very relevant, I guess, to be thinking of these genealogies. So he writes, the emergence of art museums was closely related to that of a wider range of institutions: history and natural science museums, dioramas and panoramas, national and later international, and I would add here, colonial exhibitions, arcades, and department stores. So see the interesting shift that we see from museums to department stores, and we could add shopping centers and advertisement, etc., that play within the same logics, which served as linked sites for the development and circulation of new disciplines: history, biology, artistry, anthropology, and their discursive formations: the past, evolution, aesthetics, man, here written with a small m, as well as for the development of new technologies of vision. And to these apparatus, to this constellation of things, discourses, technologies of vision, the way we give things to be seen in an exhibition, and so on and so forth, Tony Bennett called the exhibitionary complex. And this is one of the reasons why I want to stick to this term as well, in order to be able to think how we could actualize the exhibitionary complex today. Exhibition making cannot be decoupled from the institutional mechanisms that govern display and the discourses that constitute it historically and materially, including not only what is made visible, but also what is made invisible through the means of the exhibition. And here I'm thinking of the power structures, I'm thinking also of the regimes of aesthetics and cultural paradigms. Moreover, when calling today for the political role of curating in the arts, we must be mindful of these genealogies and aesthetic political legacies. That's why I was saying that institutions of display also speaks to contemporary practices and not least curatorial practices. So what about aesthetics? Following the same rationale, that we cannot separate exhibition legacies from larger technologies of visuality and making public, one cannot keep aesthetics within the notions of beauty, style, and genre. Aesthetics does not solely refer to the field of artistic practices, nor just to the thinking about art and theory of art. Instead, aesthetics is understood as a domain of social and political life in which the forms of the sayable, the thinkable, and the doable are necessarily part of how we experience and make sense of the world. And this, I'm kind of paraphrasing Jacques Rancière, and Karen this morning had already tapped into The Politics of Aesthetics, which is the title of the publication where this is fully elaborated. For that matter, a decolonial reading of the autonomy of the art object, the modern idea of the autonomy of the art object, and aesthetics locates the separation, art and life, as a construct of the project of modernity. And attention, this is not modernism, this is modernity. A reading that has been extensively articulated by decolonial scholars, including Rolando Vázquez, who says that this separation is only possible within the logics of the colonial difference, which consists of an artificial separation in the colonial episteme, whereby the world is segmented into groups that are set apart and disjointed. Some of these separations, some of these colonial differences are, for instance, I'm just going to name a few, life in the arts that I mentioned before, but also culture and knowledge, human and nature, and we had obviously Elke this morning also kind of expanding on this from the social to the ecological and opening up these spheres, but also the violence of racial and gender borders. This disjunction is responsible for the establishment of an epistemic and one could add aesthetic separation between constitutive elements of the world that, despite being radically interdependent, were set apart by the project of modernity and coloniality. I think the tangible implications of this separation is really this idea that nature is there to be exploited for the sake of the livelihood of human beings, and now we have obviously not only the Anthropocene, but very much like the tangible effects of climate change that comes out of these mindsets, of this ideology. So Rolando Vázquez argues that we cannot have a complex reading of coloniality if the critique of epistemocentrism is not interpolated and complemented with the broader field of aesthetics. And Vázquez writes, and I'm not going to read the whole quote, just the tail end of it, while the question of epistemology is concerned with the modern colonial control of knowledge and representation, the question of aesthetics brings to the fore the control of perception and representation. And so he argues that we need necessarily to be thinking of these two things together. So, how are we doing? We're doing okay? Still there? Just a brief pause. We're going to move to the second block. As I said before, and I just want to reiterate, don't think of these blocks separately, so we really need to bring these elements together. But for the sake of the argument and I guess clarity, I'm going to be separating them in these three areas. So, I guess it's important to also say, especially in relation to second and third block, that I've been practicing in the UK for the last 10 years or so. And so most of my reflections and most of my experience is necessarily related to that context, and I apologize for that. I hope that somehow, and myself as well, because But somehow I hope there are ways of connecting to the context you know and where you practice. And I'm more than happy to have conversations with you either during the Q&A or later today or tomorrow about that, because I'm also particularly interested in to think of how these things speak and are read elsewhere. So in addition to the coloniality of the exhibitionary that we just mentioned, we need to consider as well how is neoliberalism informing the paradigm of culture in our times, as I said before, but also how are our practices being informed by neoliberal logics that most of the time sit outside of the institutions and practices themselves. And I'm going to try and make this, what I mean by this sitting outside, I'll try and make this as clear as possible. So I would like to first draw your attention to the constraints imposed upon us by the expansion of the neoliberal model in institutions of display, largely oriented by external funding dependency, evaluation metrics, and the imperatives of growth and entertainment. And here growth, it's definitely an unsustainable growth that usually translates to more exhibitions, more funding, more impact, more footfall, more everything, without really thinking what's the purpose of more instead of going in depth what we are actually working with and through. So the first point I would like to shed light on is the funding system for culture. Again, UK context. More and more funding is negotiated outside of the realms of the institutions who comply with the funding rules for survival. Alongside cuts in the public investment in culture, we see funding criteria characterized by the demand of financial sustainability. And what I mean is that institutions are asked to focus on income generation and the need to diversify their funding sources, meaning donations, private funding, and external sources like foundations and things like that. While the public sector brushes away any responsibilities, institutions are forced to assess their resources for income generation, literally look at their spaces and go like, how can we rent this or what can we do with this? And so we see that the infrastructure itself, like here thinking of available space, being pretty much up for grabs. So the exhibition spaces and multi-purpose rooms that would otherwise be available for programming and for practitioners and also local communities to meet and work are now offered for commercial hire. Also, to generate income, cafes in public cultural institutions, I'm sure we're all familiar with museum cafes, have opened or have been rebranded in a fancier and more expensive fashion. Marketing teams and development teams tell curators and directors this is a way forward because we get more people through the door. Institutions have expanded their shops, and those institutions without retail outlets have definitely created some sort of attraction. And usually, if you notice, these shops are in between the entrance of the building and the reception. So a space that you necessarily need to walk through just in order to get some information from reception or even your ticket. So the financial pressure intensifies and the consequences are substantial. Without alternatives, institutions channel a substantial part of their resources, not least staff time and all the overheads that come with that, to funding applications. Hence the now familiar and prominent presence of development teams in institution departments. And I'm not sure again if this is a thing here, definitely a thing in the UK. Actually, important to say that we see the growth of these teams while we see the squeezing of the curatorial teams in these kinds of institutions. So institutions are kept busy grappling with funding applications and reports, often to the detriment of cultural programming, reflection, critical assessment. The fundamental issue here is that due to the dependence on external funding, a significant part of the strategic decisions around cultural activity and institutions' vision are determined outside of the sector's qualified expertise, because again, all these people that work in these museums, they went through a recruitment process and they are the better qualified to do the job that they are meant to be doing. But this is to say that these criteria are more and more determined by the taste and desires of the funders. And this is not to say that funders are bad and foundations are bad, etc., at all. This is just for us to shed light on what's going on in terms of how this funding structure determines what's possible and what's not possible. So the naturalization of funding applications externalizes key decisions and moreover tends to perpetuate the continuity of validated models, because again, if you apply for funding, you need to know what you are promising, and so you need to rely on things they have tested already. So it really curtails the possibility of experimentation and critical thinking and critical practices, as Maria was talking about in the introduction. So in my view, these consequences are pretty dire, and I think it hijacks the flexibility of new directions and priorities in line with the most recent developments in the field, including the recognition that changes in cultural patterns happen. So for instance, the fact that exhibitions, as I'm sure a lot of you here are interested in, are no longer the prime format in contemporary cultural practices. So what we see is also different formats emerging, but we still have the core activity of these institutions centered on trying to fill the rooms of the galleries, which, as you know, takes also a lot of resources, not least financial. So this financial model keeps institutions away from themselves, externalizing not only the funding mechanisms, but inevitably the design of the present and future of their priorities and directions. So I'm going to follow here Wendy Kyung-Shun, and this is a little bit from a different area, from machine learning and risk assessment mechanisms, but I think it's relevant for us to be thinking of how funding applications kind of, I think, become fortresses for that avoid or prevent us to be more experimental. So, because funding applications work like projections. And as media theorist Wendy Kyung-Shun argues that these projections are not only predictions, but also they have the power to determine and inform the future. And she says, and she writes, this is an interview, so it's a little bit informal, as you'll see. Their predictions, and here there stands for risk assessment brokers, their predictions are correct because they program the future. Think of something like a risk management system for credit. They will do a risk assessment of your credit based on your education, social networks, etc., and then they will give you credit or not, or give you credit at a certain interest rate. In effect, by denying you credit, they are affecting what your future will be, and these predictions are treated as truth and then acted upon. I would argue, as in risk management system for credit, funding criteria in the cultural sector are also based on the past, that is to say, on previous and tested formats, on existing audience segments, etc. Equally, the funding apparatus brings that known and tested framework to be repeated in the future, securing the governance of what can be programmed, curated, and ultimately experienced. Okay, so slowly moving to our next block. I'm not keeping time, so I don't know exactly how much I have. 5? Okay, maybe 7. So let's do this one, because I think it's hopefully where things will come together more clearly, and if not, I'm sure during the Q&A we'll be able to unpack a little bit more. So the social prescribing and social service provision in the arts. And here the question really becomes, how is the funding structure, what I just talked about, affecting the social? How is the neoliberal model informing the design and the making, so the functioning really, like the thing that happens while we interact and we think of social engaged practices, but also the social within the arts in a larger scope. So for us to understand this, and again, UK context, we need to look at key transformations in the country over there, affecting the welfare state and the move from society to communities, from state responsibility to voluntarism. For the implementation of the foundations of neoliberalism, we need to go back to the 80s, when remarkably the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, has said something along these lines. There is no such thing as society. This statement speaks to the ideological move from the idea of society as an equivalent for the people that resonates with socialist and communist speak, seen as dangerous and so on and so forth, to an atomized notion of capitalist individualism. And this is something that late Mark Fisher has theorized in a fantastic way in the publication Capitalist Realism. As a rebranding of this well-established mantra, David Cameron, who was this prime minister in the UK that stepped down after the Brexit referendum, he rebranded this slogan, or this idea of there's no such thing as society, with the slogan Big Society. A program that applies the political ideology of the free market to the functioning of society dynamics. And this is to say, less public services, so less investment in the public service, and that is now covered by free labor, aka volunteers. And this is good for people, because then they are integrated. That's what they were trying to advocate for. According to Corbett and Walker, who wrote about the big society, and I quote, "The big society draws on a mix of conservative communitarianism and libertarian paternalism. Together, they constitute a long-term vision of integrating the free market with a theory of social solidarity based on hierarchy and voluntarism." And just a reminder here, I'm not advocating against networks of solidarity. Okay, so what I'm trying to unpack here is something that goes beyond that. It's just for us to understand how these logics are actually being instrumentalized. So what one is against is the state outsourcing the welfare state to a privileged and random network of social solidarity based on the advantage of a few to give their time for free, whereas the ones in actual need must rely on the level of prestige that charity grants to those few. So how is this connected to the cultural policies and the funding structure? Well, cultural utilitarianism frames how culture came to become a big player in this sequence of things, partially taking up the responsibilities to fix the maladies of society. But for this to happen, a few changes had to be put in place. So basically, the arts, being known for having rather intangible outputs and open-ended outcomes, has kept neoliberalism busy finding ways to tame it, to apply neo-positivist models to the arts. In other words, how to measure the impact of the arts in our society, in the world. So obsessed with performance indicators and metrics to design the future, because you can only compare if you can measure, and you can only have a capital value attached to that if you can measure it. So this became like an important thing to be able to bring the arts also to play a role. So neoliberalism finds a role for the arts to ameliorate society in health and social issues at the same time that the state kind of is moved away from this investment. The public divestment in key areas of the welfare state is developed in tandem with the intensification of voluntarism, as we saw with the program of Big Society. So I would like to argue that this cultural utilitarianism, so using culture in order to improve society, has allowed the key changes in the sector. So one is directed the arts towards an improvement imperative and metrics logic. The second point is that the notions of culture became subsumed to the philosophy of the costumous service and service provision. Think, for instance, how the taxpayers were told that if they contribute, obviously, by paying taxes, in a way, everything that is part of the public investment needs to be sent back to them. So this is how it generates kind of these demands for taxpayers to be also included in these kind of social engaged activities. And not least the responsibilities of the state to be outsourced to non-experts, because obviously practitioners are not meant to. They can become experts in these particular fields, but they are not necessarily. And so outsourced to non-experts or even free labor when it comes to volunteers. And I'm coming to an end. So underfunded, understaffed, and worried about survival, professionals in the cultural sector now also feel the urge to repurpose their skills to help fix the mess. And don't get me wrong here. I think the point is not about not thinking that the arts could have a role in complementing and also being quite inspirational when it comes to societal issues. What I'm trying to point out is the impoverishment of the welfare services that should be tackled by professionals and highly skilled labor, which are nowadays replaced with low-cost, non-specialized, and creative responses of cultural practitioners. So, but things get even more complex. And this is what is the next big thing in the UK, social prescribing. Really, only to aggravate the situation, cultural utilitarianism has been updated with the so-called social prescribing agenda. And what's this? Consists of a health prescription of cultural and social activities to patients undergoing health issues, usually mental health issues. This addresses the contemporary trend that turns art into an instrument of social clinic intervention as a biomedical reasoning that seeks to impact the health and well-being of others. And this trend can be read as broader crisis of care that medicalizes the economic impacts of austerity and displaces the responsibility of care to the cultural sector. The development of social prescribing, combined with the funding oriented by cultural utilitarianism that I just described, reformulates contemporary art as a pharmacopolitical palliative for the social maladies. And in this configuration, contemporary cultural practices are subsumed into a governmental instrumentality that is defined by a therapeutical imperative. Now we need to be thinking and asking ourselves, well-being of whom? Well, the whole idea that going in and visiting a museum is a soothing experience and relaxing experience need to be based on a particular paradigm of culture. I would argue that social prescribing, I would argue that what it benefits, this kind of medicalization of cultural activities, it will benefit the Western colonial modern paradigm of the arts based on the notions of taste and beauty, and when it comes to social engagement, of consensus and normalization. So these cultural policies have enforced the dissemination of a consensual and a critical idea of well-being, and naturalized the exposure to culture as a soothing and relaxing experience, perpetuating the Western discourses of art and artistry around taste and beauty. We need to go back to the beginning of the argument, and this is my last, I promise, my last point. And this is a kind of a wrap-up, not a conclusion, but a wrap-up. So we need to go back to the beginning of the argument around the urgency to reflect on the coloniality of the exhibitionary and the need for the rehearsal of a radical and new social reimagining. The issue is that when the artistic practices are meant to provoke conversations and experiences that challenge the normative status quo, provoking conversations that are not easy and are sometimes productively upsetting. As the collective from London says, sorry you feel uncomfortable, but we need to have this conversation. How are we to foster debates around the coloniality, systemic racism, and contested histories when they are seen as upsetting for some? How are we to generate a new social imaginary when they might disrupt the consensual norms? This is indeed an historical moment where cultural institutions and art practices need to radically define the purpose of culture and construct from within new social and political imaginaries. Thank you.